These clues reveal he's been unfaithful. Carl Jung discovered something that terrified him. Not about dreams, not about archetypes, not even about the shadow. He discovered that infidelity isn't what we think it is. It's not about sex. It's not about love. It's not even about the other person. It's about something far more dangerous, a psychological fracture so profound that most people never see it coming, even when the clues are screaming at them from every corner of their lives. And here's what makes Jung's discovery so disturbing. The signs of infidelity aren't just behavioral, they're archetypal. They emerge from the collective unconscious in patterns so ancient, so deeply embedded in human psychology that your body recognizes them before your mind does. That sick feeling in your stomach when your partner comes home, that's not paranoia. That's your psyche detecting a rupture in the archetypal field, a disturbance in the psychological container that holds your relationship together. Jung spent decades studying couples in crisis. What he found shattered every conventional understanding of betrayal. The unfaithful partner isn't simply bad or weak. They're experiencing what Jung called a catastrophic psychological split, a fragmentation where the conscious persona becomes so rigid, so disconnected from authentic feeling that the shadow self erupts through an affair, desperately seeking what has been denied. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. The clues of infidelity aren't random. They follow specific archetypal patterns that have repeated across every culture, every era, every relationship since humans first formed pair bonds. These patterns emerge from the deepest layer of the unconscious. The collective psyche that Jung discovered contains the accumulated wisdom and trauma of our entire species. And once you learn to recognize these patterns, you can't unsee them. You'll notice them everywhere, in your relationship, in your friends' relationships, in the relationships of strangers at coffee shops. The clues aren't subtle, they're glaring, but we've been trained not to see them. We've been trained to trust words over energy, to trust explanations over intuition, to call our knowing insecurity and our perception jealousy. Jung warned that this training, this systematic disconnection from our instinctual wisdom, creates the perfect conditions for betrayal to flourish in darkness. Because infidelity thrives in the gap between what we sense and what we're willing to admit we sense. It lives in that space where your body knows, but your mind refuses to believe. And the longer you stay in that space, the more damage occurs, not just to your relationship, but to your psyche itself. Your capacity for trust, your ability to read reality accurately, your connection to your own instinctual knowing. All of it begins to erode slowly at first, then catastrophically. This isn't a video about catching a cheater. This is about something far more profound. This is about learning to read the archetypal language your psyche already speaks fluently, the ancient symbolic communication that your unconscious uses to warn you when something essential has fractured. Because Jung discovered that both partners in infidelity are caught in an unconscious drama, playing out roles that neither truly chose, but both are compelled to enact. The betrayed partner isn't just a victim. They're often unconsciously participating in a psychological configuration that made the relationship vulnerable to splitting. And the unfaithful partner isn't just selfish. They're often possessed by archetypal forces they don't understand, forces that are using the affair to communicate something the conscious mind refuses to hear. What you're about to learn will change how you see every relationship forever, not just romantic relationships, all relationships, because the same psychological dynamics that create infidelity create every form of betrayal, every kind of projection, every instance where we seek outside ourselves what can only be found within. Jung called this the Anima, Animus projection, the fatal tendency to project our soul onto another person rather than developing it internally. And when that projection is disrupted, when the container can no longer hold it, when the psyche splits under the pressure of unconscious material demanding expression, that's when the clues begin to appear, not as behaviors, as symptoms, symptoms of a psyche in crisis, a self-fragmenting, an individuation process that has stalled and is now erupting through the shadow in desperate, destructive ways. The question isn't whether you'll ever face these clues. The question is, when they appear, will you have the courage to see them? Will you trust your instinctual knowing over your desperate desire for everything to be okay? Will you choose consciousness over comfort? Because recognizing the clues of infidelity is not just about protecting yourself from betrayal. It's an initiation, a psychological awakening, a forced confrontation with shadow material that both partners have been avoiding. And on the other side of that confrontation lies something unexpected, not just pain, not just destruction, but the possibility of a depth of self-knowledge, a level of psychological integration, a capacity for authentic relating that most people never achieve. Jung discovered this through his own shattering experiences with infidelity, experiences that nearly destroyed him, but ultimately became the crucible for his most profound insights about the human psyche. What he learned could save you years of suffering, or it could shatter every illusion you're currently using to avoid facing the truth. Either way, you won't be the same person after this video, because once you learn to see the archetypal patterns of betrayal, once you understand the psychological split that creates infidelity, once you recognize these clues in your own life, you can never return to unconscious relating. The innocent version of you, the one who trusts blindly, who ignores instinct, who chooses comfort over truth, that version dies. And something more powerful, more awake, more psychologically sovereign takes its place. This is Jung's most dangerous teaching on relationships, not because it's complicated, because it's true. And truth, as Jung always said, is the most dangerous thing of all. Jung gave it a name that most people have never heard. He called it Anima, Animus projection disorder, a psychological emergency where the soul is unconsciously split off from the self and projected entirely onto another person. This isn't ordinary attraction. This isn't even obsessive love. This is a catastrophic rupture in the psyche where everything that gives life meaning, all vitality, all depth, all sense of being fully alive, becomes located outside the self, in another human being. And when that projection is threatened, when the person carrying your soul begins to feel like a stranger, when the relationship can no longer sustain the weight of what you've unconsciously demanded it carry, that's when the psyche begins to search, desperately, unconsciously, compulsively, for another vessel to hold what you refuse to develop internally. Jung discovered this pattern in patient after patient, intelligent people, moral people, people who genuinely loved their partners and never imagined they'd become unfaithful. But they all shared one thing, a profound unconsciousness about their inner contrasexual archetype. For men, the anima, the inner feminine, the soul image, the capacity for feeling relatedness and emotional depth. For women, the animus, the inner masculine, the spirit image, the capacity for assertion, clarity, and directed will. When these inner figures remain completely unconscious, they don't simply stay dormant. They begin to autonomously seek expression through possession. The person becomes gripped by what feels like a force beyond their control, an overwhelming attraction that seems to carry all meaning, all vitality, all possibility for authentic life. Jung called this being in love with one's own unconscious projection. The affair partner isn't actually special. They're simply the screen onto which the unconscious projects the undeveloped soul image. They seem to embody everything missing from the primary relationship because they're literally carrying the projected missing pieces of the unfaithful partner's psyche. This is why affairs often feel so intoxicating, so destined, so much more real than the committed relationship. The person isn't falling in love with another human being. They're falling in love with their own rejected soul material, finally visible in external form. And here's what makes this condition so dangerous in the modern world. Our culture has created perfect conditions for this psychological split to occur on a massive scale. We've systematized the disconnection from soul. We've industrialized the creation of false personas. We've built an entire civilization on shallow relating, instant gratification, and the avoidance of psychological depth. Social media trains us to project constantly, to see idealized versions of reality, to compare our inner experience to others' outer presentation, to seek validation from external sources rather than developing internal wholeness. Dating apps condition us to treat human beings as replaceable commodities. If this one doesn't satisfy, swipe to the next projection screen. Pornography fragments sexuality from soul, training millions to relate to images rather than embodied human beings, creating a population whose erotic energy is completely divorced from genuine intimacy. And perhaps most dangerously, we've lost the cultural containers, the rituals, the elders, the initiations that once helped people integrate their contrasexual archetype through symbolic means rather than literal affairs. Jung observed that traditional cultures had elaborate rituals and mythological frameworks that allowed people to encounter their anima or animus symbolically. Vision quests, mystery initiations, sacred marriage ceremonies, alchemical processes, all of these provided structured ways to integrate the inner opposite without destroying actual relationships. Modern culture offers nothing equivalent. Instead, we're told that if a relationship feels dead, if the spark is gone, if you're not happy, then you should leave and find someone who makes you feel alive again. This advice isn't just shallow, it's psychologically catastrophic because it trains people to seek externally what can only be found internally, to abandon relationships the moment projection fades, rather than using that fading as an opportunity to develop the soul capacities they've been projecting onto their partner. The result is an epidemic of serial projection. People move from relationship to relationship, always finding the same disillusionment eventually, never understanding that they're encountering their own psychological material dressed in different bodies. Jung called this the eternal return of the same, the compulsion to repeat unconscious patterns until we finally develop the consciousness to see what we're doing. And infidelity is one of the most common manifestations of this compulsion. The affair isn't really about the new person. It's about the old, unintegrated material that the psyche is desperately trying to process. But here's the part that most people miss, the part that makes recognizing infidelity clues so critical. The unfaithful partner's psyche is screaming for help long before any physical affair occurs. The clues aren't just behavioral signs of deception. They're unconscious communications, symptoms of a psychological split that's threatening to tear the person apart. Increased emotional distance, sudden preoccupation with appearance, defensive reactions to innocent questions, mysterious new interests that exclude the partner, a strange combination of being more animated in general but more lifeless with you specifically. These aren't just red flags. They're the psyche's attempt to signal that something catastrophic is happening beneath conscious awareness, that the persona has become so rigid that the shadow is erupting, that the anima or animus has become so unconscious that it's seeking external incarnation, that the self is fragmenting under the weight of unlived life, denied desire, and refused individuation. Jung understood that most people who become unfaithful are suffering, not in ways they can articulate, not in ways they're even consciously aware of, but suffering nonetheless from a profound disconnection from their authentic self, a split between who they present to the world and who they actually are, between what they consciously want and what their unconscious desperately needs. The affair becomes a temporary solution to an existential crisis. It offers a taste of aliveness, a sense of being seen, a feeling of possibility that the person has lost in their primary relationship, not because their partner is inadequate, but because they've lost access to their own soul and are now seeking it in another person's body. This is Anima Animus projection disorder, and it's epidemic. Relationship therapists report that infidelity is now the #1 reason couples seek treatment. Some studies suggest that 40–50% of marriages experience some form of infidelity, but Jung would say these numbers actually underestimate the problem, because the psychological condition that creates physical affairs also creates emotional affairs, fantasy affairs, and what he called internal infidelity, the constant psychic investment in imagined alternatives rather than the actual relationship. How many people are physically faithful but emotionally absent, sexually exclusive but psychologically invested elsewhere, technically committed but fundamentally unavailable? The cultural obsession with whether someone has physically cheated misses the deeper reality Jung identified. Infidelity begins the moment projection becomes more real than relationship, the moment you're relating to your fantasy of your partner rather than the actual human being in front of you, the moment you stop doing the psychological work required for genuine intimacy and instead seek the temporary high of projection and idealization. And in a culture that systematically trains us to live on the surface, to avoid depth, to fear the shadow, to seek easy solutions to existential problems, this psychological split has become our default mode of relating. We're swimming in projected relationships. Affairs are just the most obvious symptom of a much deeper disease, the collective inability to develop our inner contrasexual archetype, to integrate our shadow, to become whole rather than seeking wholeness through another person. And the clues of infidelity, they're the whispers of the psyche, trying desperately to alert both partners that something essential has been lost, that fragmentation is occurring, that consciousness is urgently needed before complete destruction occurs. The question is, are you listening? Or are you, like most people, trained to dismiss your knowing, to call your intuition paranoia, to choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, because the clues are always there? The psyche cannot hide this kind of split. It leaks through every interaction, every behavioral change, every shift in energy. Your unconscious recognizes these patterns instantly, but your conscious mind, especially if it's been colonized by cultural narratives about trust, loyalty, and giving the benefit of the doubt, may refuse to see what your body already knows. And that refusal, Jung warned, has devastating consequences, not just for the relationship, for your psyche itself, for your capacity to trust your own perception of reality, for your connection to the instinctual wisdom that could protect you from years of suffering. This is why recognizing infidelity clues isn't about becoming suspicious or paranoid. It's about psychological literacy, about learning to read the language your unconscious already speaks fluently, about reclaiming the perceptual capacities that modern culture has systematically trained out of you, and about understanding that if you're in a relationship with someone who's experiencing Anima Animus projection disorder, the clues will appear, not because they want to get caught, because the psyche can't sustain that level of splitting without symptoms emerging. The question is whether you have the courage to see them. Emma first noticed it on a Tuesday morning in March. Nothing dramatic, Nothing obvious, just a feeling. Her husband David was making coffee, humming a song she didn't recognize, and there was something about the way he moved through the kitchen, lighter somehow, more animated, that made her stomach tighten. She couldn't articulate why. There was no evidence, no suspicious text messages, no late nights at the office, no obvious signs, just this strange sensation that the man standing in her kitchen was both her husband and a stranger simultaneously. Jung would have recognized this immediately as the Anima function, Emma's own unconscious wisdom alerting her to a rupture in the archetypal field long before her conscious mind could process what was happening. But Emma did what most people do. She dismissed it. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that 12 years of marriage had made her take David for granted, that she should be happy he seemed energized rather than suspicious. She pushed the feeling down and went about her day. But the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger. Over the next 3 weeks, Emma's unconscious kept sending signals that her conscious mind kept rejecting. David became obsessed with his appearance in ways he'd never been before. New clothes, a sudden interest in fitness, expensive haircuts, cologne she'd never seen before. When she commented on it, he became defensive. "Can't a guy take care of himself? You're always complaining I don't make an effort." Except Emma hadn't complained. She'd simply noticed the change. This defensiveness, Jung called it projective identification, was one of the first major clues. David was attributing criticism to Emma that she hadn't actually expressed because his psyche was anticipating exposure. The guilty conscience was creating scenarios to defend against before they'd even occurred. Then came the phone changes. David had never been particularly protective of his phone. It would sit on the counter while he showered, unlocked and accessible. Emma had never felt compelled to look because there'd never been reason to, but suddenly the phone was always face down, always in his pocket. He'd changed the notification settings so messages didn't preview on the lock screen. When Emma mentioned it casually, "Did you change your phone settings?" David exploded. "Why are you keeping track of my phone? Do you not trust me?" This is exactly the kind of controlling behavior that makes relationships toxic. Emma was stunned. She'd asked a simple question and been met with what Jung would recognize as shadow projection, David accusing her of the very violation he was perpetrating. But what Emma found most disturbing wasn't the anger. It was what came after. David immediately softened, apologized, told her he'd been stressed at work and was sorry for snapping. Then he became unusually affectionate, bringing her flowers, suggesting a date night, being more attentive than he'd been in months. Jung wrote extensively about this pattern. He called it enantiodromia, the sudden conversion into the opposite. The unfaithful partner swings between emotional withdrawal and sudden excessive attention, between distance and intimacy, between coldness and warmth, never settling into a consistent emotional baseline. This isn't intentional manipulation. It's the psyche fragmenting under the weight of maintaining two incompatible realities simultaneously. The part of David that loved Emma and felt guilty was surging forward with flowers and apologies. The part that was invested elsewhere was creating distance and defensiveness. Neither part was integrated. Both were unconsciously driving behavior. Emma recognized something was deeply wrong, but she still didn't want to believe it was an affair. She tried other explanations. Midlife crisis, work stress, depression. Maybe he was questioning their relationship but hadn't actually done anything. She initiated conversations about their marriage. David said everything was fine, better than fine. He told her he loved her, that she was being insecure, that she needed to stop looking for problems where none existed. This was perhaps the most damaging phase, what Jung called the gaslighting of instinct. Emma's unconscious knew the truth. Her body knew, her dreams knew. She'd started having vivid dreams of David with a faceless woman, dreams of searching for him in empty houses, dreams of drowning while he stood on the shore watching. Jung taught that dreams don't lie. They can't. They're direct communications from the unconscious, showing us what we refuse to see consciously. But Emma had been raised, like most people, to trust words over somatic knowing, to believe logical explanations over instinctual wisdom, to call her intuition anxiety and her perception insecurity. So she entered therapy, not couples therapy. David refused, saying there was nothing wrong, but individual therapy to work on her trust issues. Her therapist, unfortunately, wasn't trained in Jungian depth psychology. She offered cognitive behavioral strategies to challenge Emma's irrational thoughts and manage her anxiety. The message was clear. The problem was Emma's perception, not David's behavior. This, Jung warned, is how the psyche gets trapped in what he called the torture of the divided self. Emma knew, and she was being told her knowing was pathological. The gap between these two realities began to fracture something essential in her psyche. She started doubting everything, her perceptions, her judgments, her capacity to read reality accurately. She became hypervigilant and exhausted. She'd scan David's face for clues, analyze his words for hidden meanings, replay conversations looking for contradictions. This wasn't paranoia. This was a healthy psyche trying desperately to resolve cognitive dissonance, to make sense of why her unconscious kept screaming danger while her conscious mind kept hearing reassurance. Then came the shift that Jung called shadow leakage, when the splitting becomes so extreme that the unconscious material begins erupting in ways the person can no longer control. David started talking about personal growth and finding himself. He read books on spirituality, attended workshops on authentic living, began meditating and journaling. On the surface, this seemed positive. Emma felt guilty for viewing it with suspicion, but Jung would have immediately recognized it as inflation of the false self, the ego becoming possessed by archetypal energies and mistaking this possession for spiritual awakening. David's personal growth excluded Emma entirely. His journey toward authenticity involved keeping secrets, maintaining distance, creating a separate life she wasn't invited into. He talked constantly about needing space, about how codependency was preventing his individuation, about how Emma's need for closeness was stifling his development. This is spiritual bypassing, as Jung understood it, using authentic psychological concepts as weapons to justify shadow behavior, disguising fragmentation as integration, calling projection soul connection, and a fair fog awakening. Emma finally reached her breaking point on a Friday evening in June. David was texting during dinner, smiling at his phone with an expression she'd never seen, a kind of secret joy that clearly had nothing to do with her. When she asked who he was texting, he said, "Just a friend from work," with that same defensive edge she'd come to dread. Something in Emma cracked open, not anger, clarity. Jung called these moments the eruption of the self, when the unconscious accumulates enough evidence that the conscious mind can no longer maintain its defenses. Emma asked directly, "Are you having an affair?" David's face did something extraordinary. It cycled through shock, anger, hurt, and calculation in about 3 seconds, micro-expressions that revealed everything. Then he said, "I can't believe you'd ask me that. After everything we've been through, do you really think so little of me?" But this time, Emma didn't back down. She didn't apologize. She didn't internalize the shame he was projecting onto her. She said, "I need you to look me in the eyes and tell me the truth." And David couldn't do it. He broke eye contact. He started to cry. He said he needed to think. He left the house. He came back 3 hours later and confessed. Her name was Rachel. They'd met at a conference 7 months ago. It started as just conversation, became emotional intimacy, and eventually turned physical. David swore he loved Emma. He said he never meant for it to happen. He claimed he was confused, that Rachel understood him in ways Emma couldn't, that he'd been planning to end it but didn't know how. All of this was true, and none of it was true. Jung would say David was speaking from the possessed ego, the part of his psyche that had been overtaken by his unconscious anima projection, the part that genuinely believed Rachel was his soulmate because she was carrying all his rejected psychological material. But here's what happened next that made Emma's journey so remarkable. Instead of collapsing into either revenge or self-blame, Emma did something most people don't have the psychological capacity to do. She asked David to leave. Not permanently. She didn't know yet whether the marriage could survive, but she needed space to process, without his chaos contaminating her clarity. And then she began the most difficult work of her life, not just grieving the betrayal, withdrawing her own projections. Emma spent the next 3 months in intensive Jungian analysis, and what she discovered shattered her even more than David's affair. She'd been seeking her animus in him for their entire marriage. She'd projected her capacity for assertiveness, her creative ambition, her spiritual authority all onto David, then resented him when he failed to embody these qualities consistently. She'd abandoned her own artistic practice when they got married, telling herself it wasn't practical, that someone had to be the stable one while David pursued his career. But the truth was darker. She'd been terrified of her own power, her own desires, her own potential for destruction. So she'd created a marriage where she could remain small and safe, where David carried all the ambition and risk, where she could avoid the terrifying work of becoming whole. And when David's projection of his anima onto Rachel made him unavailable for Emma's animus projection, when he could no longer carry her unlived life, her psyche started to scream. Not because David was a bad person, because Emma's psychological configuration had depended on him being a certain way, and when he stopped performing that role, her entire internal structure began collapsing. This is the part of Jung's teaching on infidelity that most people can't metabolize. Both partners are participating in unconscious patterns. Both are projecting. Both are avoiding aspects of individuation. The affair isn't just one person's failure. It's a symptom of a relational system that was built on projection rather than psychological wholeness. Understanding this didn't make Emma responsible for David's choices. He'd chosen to betray their agreements. He'd chosen deception over honesty. He'd chosen to fragment rather than face his shadow. But it did make Emma responsible for her own integration, for reclaiming the parts of herself she'd projected onto him, for developing her animus internally rather than seeking it externally, for becoming whole regardless of whether the marriage survived. 6 months after David's confession, Emma made her decision. She asked for a divorce, not from rage, not from hurt, but from clarity. Emma realized that whether or not David could heal his splitting, whether or not he could integrate his anima projection, whether or not he could become capable of authentic relating, those were his problems to solve. Her work was different. Her work was becoming psychologically sovereign and staying in a marriage where she'd betrayed herself long before David betrayed her would be a refusal of that work. Jung would have called this the withdrawal of projection leading to individuation. Emma stopped seeking her wholeness through David and began the painful, exhilarating process of developing it internally. She returned to her painting. She started taking up space in ways she'd never allowed herself before. She developed her capacity for assertion, for clarity, for direct communication, all animus functions she'd disowned. And something remarkable happened. The obsessive focus on David's betrayal began to fade, not because it didn't matter, it did, but because Emma's psyche had found something more important to attend to, her own becoming. This is what Jung meant when he said that recognizing infidelity clues is an initiation. It destroys the naive, unconscious relationship forever. It forces both partners to confront shadow material they'd been avoiding. It demands a level of psychological honesty that most people spend their entire lives evading. But on the other side of that destruction lies the possibility of genuine transformation. Not necessarily reconciliation, not guaranteed happiness, but something deeper: psychological integrity, authentic selfhood, the capacity to relate from wholeness rather than neediness. Emma's journey through recognizing the clues, confronting the truth, and choosing integration over victimhood became her path to individuation. The affair that shattered her naive self became the catalyst for her authentic self to emerge. And that, Jung understood, is the hidden gift buried inside every betrayal, if you have the courage to receive it. What Jung understood intuitively, modern neuroscience and psychology are now confirming empirically. Infidelity follows predictable patterns. The clues emerge from hardwired psychological and neurological processes that are consistent across cultures, genders, and individual differences. Research from attachment theory, evolutionary psychology, behavioral science, and neuroscience is revealing that the archetypal patterns Jung identified aren't mystical. They're biological, psychological, and deeply embedded in how human beings form and break intimate bonds. Let's start with the numbers because they're more devastating than most people realize. Studies vary depending on how infidelity is defined, but conservative estimates suggest that between 20 and 25% of married individuals admit to having had a physical affair. When the definition expands to include emotional affairs, sustained intimate connection with someone outside the primary relationship that involves secrecy and emotional investment, that number jumps to 35–45%. And when researchers include what they call online infidelity, sexting, pornography use that involves interaction with specific individuals, emotional intimacy through digital platforms, some studies suggest that over 50% of relationships experience some form of betrayal. But Jung would say even these numbers miss the deeper reality, because they're measuring behaviors, not psychological states. How many people are physically faithful but emotionally absent? Sexually exclusive but psychologically invested elsewhere? Technically monogamous but living in constant fantasy about alternatives? The psychological condition that creates physical affairs, what Jung called Anima, Animus projection disorder, is far more widespread than the behavioral manifestation, and modern research is beginning to understand why. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and expanded by researchers like Sue Johnson and Stan Tatkin, reveals that how we bond or fail to bond in infancy creates templates that determine our adult relational patterns. People with avoidant attachment, those who learned early that emotional needs wouldn't be met reliably, tend to create distance in relationships and are statistically more likely to engage in affairs as a way to maintain psychological autonomy while appearing committed. People with anxious attachment, those who learned that love is inconsistent and must be constantly pursued, often become hypervigilant to abandonment cues, but may engage in affairs as a way to preemptively protect themselves from anticipated rejection or to feel desired when they sense their partner withdrawing. These aren't character flaws. They're adaptive strategies formed in childhood that become maladaptive in adult intimate relationships. Jung understood this as the personal unconscious interacting with archetypal patterns, individual wounding meeting collective human templates for bonding and betrayal. Modern research has also identified what therapists call affair fog, a dissociative state that unfaithful partners enter that Jung would immediately recognize as possession by archetypal energy. During affair fog, people report feeling like they're not themselves. They make decisions completely contrary to their values. They say things like, "I don't know what came over me," or "It was like I was watching someone else." Brain imaging studies show that this isn't metaphorical. When someone is in the throes of limerence, that intoxicating early stage of romantic obsession, their brain looks remarkably similar to someone on cocaine. The ventral tegmental area floods with dopamine. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment and impulse control, shows decreased activity. The nucleus accumbens, the reward center, lights up like a Christmas tree. This isn't love, it's addiction. And like all addictions, it involves a fundamental disconnection from reality. The person becomes convinced that the source of the dopamine hit is essential for survival, that life without this person would be meaningless, that this connection is more real than anything they've experienced before. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where ego boundaries dissolve and the person experiences mystical union not with the divine, but with their own unconscious projection. The affair partner isn't carrying their soul, but the neurochemistry makes it feel that way. Research by Helen Fisher and others has shown that this limerence state typically lasts 12 to 24 months. After that, the dopamine receptors downregulate, the prefrontal cortex comes back online, and reality begins to intrude. This is why so many affairs that seem so destined and spiritually significant end in disillusionment. The possession phase ends, the projection collapses, and the person is left with an actual human being rather than an archetypal image, usually discovering they've destroyed a stable relationship for what was essentially a neurochemical hallucination. But here's what makes modern research so valuable for recognizing infidelity clues. Scientists have identified specific behavioral and psychological markers that reliably predict infidelity and that are detectable in the early stages. Behavioral baseline shifts are one of the most reliable indicators. Everyone has a behavioral baseline, their normal patterns of communication, affection, routine, emotional responsiveness. When infidelity begins, this baseline shifts in predictable ways. Dr. Gottman's research identified what he calls turning away behaviors. In healthy relationships, partners make bids for connection, small requests for attention, affection, or engagement, and the other partner turns toward these bids about 86% of the time. When infidelity is occurring, the unfaithful partner's turning toward rate drops dramatically, often below 50%. They become consistently unavailable, distracted, or dismissive of their partner's bids for connection. This isn't because they suddenly stopped caring. It's because their emotional and psychological energy is invested elsewhere. They're turning toward the affair partner instead. Research on deception has identified micro-expressions, brief, involuntary facial expressions that reveal true emotions before the person can mask them. Paul Ekman's work shows that when people lie about emotionally significant material, their face flashes genuine emotion, fear, guilt, excitement, for about 1/5 of a second before the conscious expression takes over. Emma noticed this with David, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to be deliberate when she first asked if he was having an affair. These micro-expressions are hardwired and nearly impossible to suppress because they emerge from subcortical brain regions that operate below conscious control. Your unconscious recognizes them even when you're not consciously aware you're seeing them. This is why you might feel something is wrong even when you can't articulate what you noticed. Research on voice patterns reveals another reliable clue. When people lie, especially about emotionally charged material, their vocal patterns change in subtle ways. Pitch often rises slightly. Speech rate may increase or decrease depending on the person's stress response. There are more verbal hedges and qualifiers. To be honest, frankly, I swear, as if they're trying to convince themselves as much as you. These changes are automatic responses to the cognitive load of maintaining deception while managing the stress of potential exposure. But perhaps the most fascinating research comes from studies on intuition and unconscious perception. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's work on somatic markers shows that our bodies register truth and danger before our conscious minds process the information. That sick feeling in your stomach, that tightening in your chest, that vague sense of unease. These aren't anxiety or paranoia. They're your body's rapid assessment system alerting you to environmental threats based on subtle cues you're not consciously processing. Emma experienced this the first morning she noticed David humming in the kitchen. Her conscious mind had no evidence, but her somatic system had already detected the rupture in their relational field. Studies on thin slicing, our ability to make accurate judgments based on minimal information, show that people can often detect deception or relationship problems from observing just a few seconds of interaction. Your unconscious is processing thousands of micro-cues simultaneously. Body language, tone, eye contact patterns, emotional congruence, energetic shifts. It synthesizes all of this into what feels like intuition, but is actually sophisticated pattern recognition, operating below conscious awareness. This is what Jung meant when he said the unconscious knows. Modern research validates what he observed clinically. Your psyche recognizes archetypal patterns of betrayal instantly because they're hardwired into collective human experience. The question isn't whether the clues are present. They always are. The psyche cannot maintain that level of splitting without symptoms. The question is whether you're allowing yourself to perceive what your unconscious already knows. Research on cognitive dissonance helps explain why this is so difficult. When evidence contradicts deeply held beliefs, like my partner would never betray me or I can trust my judgment about character, the brain experiences genuine distress. MRI studies show activation in the same regions that process physical pain. To reduce this distress, people engage in motivated reasoning, selectively attending to evidence that supports their preferred belief, while dismissing or reinterpreting contradictory information. This isn't stupidity, it's psychological self-protection. Your psyche is trying to avoid the catastrophic pain of acknowledging betrayal and the accompanying ego death of admitting you didn't see it coming. So you explain away the clues, you rationalize the inconsistencies, you gaslight your own intuition. Research shows this is especially true for people with anxious attachment or those who've been previously betrayed. They're often hypervigilant to clues, but simultaneously desperate to believe everything is okay, creating a torture loop of noticing and denying. But there's another layer to modern research that's particularly relevant to Jung's framework. Studies on relationship satisfaction versus relationship stability reveal something surprising. Many people report being satisfied with their relationships right up until the moment they discover infidelity. Their conscious assessment of the relationship was positive, even though, in retrospect, they can identify numerous warning signs. This suggests that conscious satisfaction is often based on the persona, the surface presentation of the relationship, while unconscious dissatisfaction accumulates in the shadow. Jung would say this is the psyche's way of showing you what you're refusing to see consciously. Your dreams become troubled. Your body becomes tense. Your intuition keeps nagging, but your conscious mind maintains the narrative that everything is fine, because acknowledging the truth would require action, change, and the death of your current life structure. Research on trauma, bonding, and intermittent reinforcement explains why recognizing clues becomes even harder once you've started noticing them. When a partner alternates between emotional unavailability and sudden affection, remember David's pattern of distance followed by flowers and apologies. It creates a variable reward schedule, that's neurologically identical to gambling addiction. Your brain becomes fixated on trying to figure out what brings the reward, affection, attention, connection, and how to avoid the punishment, withdrawal, anger, coldness. This keeps you focused on managing the relationship rather than objectively assessing whether something fundamental has changed. And the intermittent positive reinforcement, those moments when your partner seems like their old self, when connection briefly returns, becomes proof that you're paranoid, that you're creating problems, that everything is actually fine. This is gaslighting at the neurological level. Your partner might not be consciously manipulating you, but their fragmented psyche is creating behavioral patterns that literally hijack your brain's reward system, making clear perception almost impossible. Modern research on affairs has also identified predictable phases that align perfectly with Jung's archetypal framework. Phase 1. Boundary erosion. This is where emotional intimacy with someone outside the relationship begins to deepen while appropriate boundaries aren't maintained. The person tells themselves, "We're just friends," while unconsciously beginning to invest psychic energy elsewhere. Jung would call this the first stage of projection, the anima animus beginning to stir toward an external object. Phase 2. Secrecy and separation. The person begins creating separate spaces, separate accounts, separate activities, separate emotional lives that exclude their primary partner. This is the psyche splitting, creating compartments that don't communicate with each other. Jung observed that this compartmentalization is psychologically exhausting and always produces behavioral clues. Phase 3. Rationalization and justification. The person develops narratives about why this connection is acceptable or necessary. My partner doesn't understand me. This person makes me feel alive. I deserve to be happy. These aren't lies exactly. They're the possessed ego speaking, the part that's been overtaken by archetypal energy and is now creating elaborate justifications for shadow behavior. Phase 4. Physical escalation. If the affair becomes sexual, there's often a brief period of extreme guilt, followed by what researchers call the doubling down. The person becomes even more invested in the affair to justify having crossed the line. Jung understood this as the point where the shadow has fully possessed the ego. The person can no longer acknowledge what they're doing without complete psychological collapse. Phase 5. Discovery or confession. Eventually, the splitting becomes unsustainable. Either the clues become too obvious to ignore, or the unfaithful partner's psyche forces exposure through accidental discovery or spontaneous confession. Jung saw this as the self's intervention. The psyche can only maintain radical dishonesty for so long before it stages its own revelation. Understanding these phases helps explain why the clues often start subtle and become progressively more obvious. The psyche isn't trying to maintain deception indefinitely. At some level, it's seeking integration, seeking truth, seeking the crisis that will force consciousness. This is why Jung said that symptoms are often the psyche's attempt at self-healing. The clues aren't just evidence of betrayal. They're the unconscious reaching toward wholeness, even if that wholeness requires destruction of the current structure. Modern research has also shed light on gender differences in infidelity patterns, though Jung would caution against overgeneralizing. Studies show men are slightly more likely to engage in purely sexual affairs without emotional attachment, while women are more likely to develop emotional intimacy before physical involvement. But Jung's framework suggests this isn't about gender essentialism. It's about which aspect of the contrasexual archetype remains most unconscious. Men who haven't integrated their anima, their capacity for emotional depth, vulnerability, and relatedness, are more vulnerable to affairs that seem to offer those qualities. They're not seeking sex primarily, they're seeking soul connection, but can only access it through sexualized relationships. because that's the only form of vulnerability they've developed. Women who haven't integrated their animus, their capacity for assertion, autonomy, and directed will, are more vulnerable to affairs with men who seem to embody these qualities: the strong man, the decisive man, the man who makes her feel protected or empowered. She's projecting her own undeveloped masculine capacities onto another person. Of course, these patterns appear in all genders and sexual orientations. The key isn't the gender, it's the projection dynamic. Research on reconciliation after infidelity reveals something that aligns perfectly with Jung's individuation framework. About 60–75% of couples attempt to stay together after infidelity is discovered, but only about 15–20% successfully rebuild a relationship that's psychologically healthy rather than just sustained through fear, codependency, or avoidance. What distinguishes the successful couples? Esther Perel's research shows it's not whether the unfaithful partner is truly sorry or whether the betrayed partner can truly forgive. It's whether both partners can use the crisis as an opportunity for radical honesty and psychological growth. The couples who succeed are those where both partners withdraw their projections, integrate their shadow material, and rebuild the relationship on genuine intimacy rather than idealization. The couples who fail are those where one or both partners remain in victim-villain dynamics, where projection continues, where the betrayal becomes the defining story rather than one chapter in a larger transformation narrative. Jung would say, the successful couples achieved what the majority cannot. They used betrayal as initiation into individuation rather than just trauma to survive or avoid. But modern research also confirms Jung's warning about the dangers of premature forgiveness or cheap reconciliation. Studies on rug sweeping, quickly moving past infidelity without processing the shadow material it revealed, show that these relationships often experience repeated betrayals or develop other pathological patterns to manage the unprocessed material. The betrayed partner may develop anxiety disorders, depression, or hypervigilance that persists for years. The unfaithful partner may develop shame spirals that prevent genuine transformation. Both remain trapped in the trauma rather than transformed by it. This is because the psyche doesn't accept superficial solutions to archetypal problems. You can't just decide to move on from something that revealed fundamental truths about both partners' shadow material, projection patterns, and capacity for authentic relating. The transformation requires descent into the underworld. Grief, rage, shame, despair, and most people, most therapists, most cultural narratives encourage skipping that descent in favor of quick fixes. Jung insisted there are no shortcuts through the individuation process. The shadow must be faced. The projections must be withdrawn. The death must be suffered before rebirth becomes possible. Modern research on post-traumatic growth confirms this Jungian insight. Studies show that people who experience severe trauma and infidelity qualifies as severe relational trauma often emerge with what researchers call post-traumatic growth, increased psychological resilience, deeper capacity for authentic connection, greater life meaning, and enhanced personal strength. But this growth only occurs when people actively engage with the trauma rather than avoiding or minimizing it. The ones who grow are the ones who ask hard questions. What was I refusing to see? What projections was I maintaining? How did I participate in creating a relational field where this could occur? What does this reveal about my shadow? These questions aren't about self-blame. They're about reclaiming psychological agency and using the crisis as material for transformation. And finally, research on intuition and decision-making reveals something crucial about recognizing infidelity clues. Studies by Gerd Gigerenzer and others show that in complex situations with many variables, like assessing whether a partner is being faithful, intuition often outperforms analytical reasoning. Your gut feeling, based on unconscious pattern recognition of thousands of subtle cues, is frequently more accurate than your conscious attempt to evaluate each piece of evidence logically. This is why Emma's initial sick feeling in the kitchen was more trustworthy than her subsequent rationalizations. This is why your body's response often knows before your mind admits. This is why Jung placed such emphasis on learning to read symbolic and somatic language, because that's where truth lives when conscious narratives are invested in maintaining comfortable lies. The research is clear. Infidelity follows predictable patterns. The clues emerge reliably. Your unconscious recognizes them accurately. The only question is whether you're psychologically ready to face what you already know. Because recognizing the clues isn't the hard part. The hard part is what comes after, acknowledging that the relationship you thought you had doesn't exist, that your partner isn't who you believed them to be, that you'll need to make decisions that will permanently alter your life. That's why most people choose not to see. Not because the evidence isn't there, because seeing it would require becoming a different person, one who trusts their intuition, who faces hard truths, who prioritizes psychological integrity over comfortable illusions. And Jung understood that most people will choose the comfortable illusion every time, until the pain of staying unconscious exceeds the fear of becoming conscious. That's when transformation becomes possible. Jung discovered that infidelity isn't random. It follows specific archetypal patterns that emerge from the collective unconscious, templates of human behavior that have repeated across cultures and centuries because they reflect fundamental psychological configurations. Understanding which pattern is operating in your situation doesn't just help you recognize the clues. It reveals the deeper shadow material seeking expression through the betrayal. Because infidelity is never just about the affair, it's a symptom of a specific psychological constellation that was present long before any physical transgression occurred. Let's explore the 7 primary patterns Jung identified, along with the behavioral clues that emerge from each archetypal configuration. This is the pattern of the person who refuses psychological maturity, the puer aeternus, Latin for eternal boy, though it applies to all genders, lives in constant pursuit of novelty, intensity, and romantic idealization while fleeing the transformative fire of commitment. Jung observed that this archetype is epidemic in modern culture, which systematically rewards adolescent psychology and punishes genuine adult development. The puer experiences relationships in cycles, intense idealization where the new partner seems perfect and full of possibility, followed by gradual disillusionment as reality intrudes, followed by restless searching for the next person who can reignite that initial intensity. They're not seeking love. They're seeking the neurochemical high of limerence, the ego inflation of conquest, the escape from existential anxiety that new romance temporarily provides. The clues for pure pattern infidelity: chronic dissatisfaction despite objectively good relationships. They'll say things like something is missing or the spark is gone without being able to articulate what specifically is wrong. Romanticization of the past mixed with future fantasy. They talk constantly about previous relationships that were perfect, they weren't, or about their dream relationship that doesn't exist yet. Boredom as their primary emotional state. Routine feels like death. Commitment feels like imprisonment. They need constant stimulation and become increasingly unavailable as the relationship stabilizes into normal life. Sudden enthusiasm for new hobbies, friend groups, or activities that exclude the partner. This isn't healthy autonomy. It's the pure's psyche searching for the next source of novelty, and avoiding the intimate demands of the current relationship. Defensive responses to questions about long-term planning or deeper commitment. Marriage, children, buying property together, anything that makes the relationship more real and less escapable triggers anxiety and resistance. The pure often engages in serial emotional affairs even before physical involvement. They're constantly cultivating backup relationships, maintaining connections with exes, forming intense friendships with potential romantic partners, all unconsciously preparing for the inevitable moment when their current relationship becomes boring. Jung saw the poor as someone whose anima or animus remains in an idealized fantasy state rather than being integrated into realistic self-understanding. They're in love with love, not with actual human beings. They're seeking the archetypal image rather than embodied relationship. Affairs provide temporary relief from this existential crisis. The new person seems to embody everything missing from their life until they don't, and the cycle begins again. The shadow material here is the refusal to face mortality, limitation, and the slow, often unglamorous work of building something real with an actual person rather than an idealized fantasy. This pattern emerges when someone's false self becomes so dominant that external validation becomes a psychological necessity. The persona in Jung's framework is the social mask we present to the world, the adapted self that performs acceptability. Everyone has one. It's necessary for social functioning. But when the persona inflates and begins to replace the authentic self, the person becomes completely dependent on external confirmation of their worth, desirability, and significance. They cannot feel real unless someone is actively desiring them, admiring them, choosing them. Affairs become proof of desirability and a defense against genuine intimacy, which would expose the emptiness beneath the polished surface. The clues for persona inflation pattern: obsessive focus on appearance and image, not healthy self-care but compulsive grooming, strategic self-presentation, constant monitoring of how they're perceived. The body becomes a project designed to attract admiration rather than a home to inhabit. Social media performance that seems disconnected from their actual life. They're curating an image of themselves as successful, desirable, living their best life, while their actual relationship is lifeless and their inner experience is empty. Hypersensitivity to criticism or perceived slights. Because the persona is a false self, any threat to it feels like annihilation. They'll react disproportionately to minor feedback because it penetrates the defensive structure they've built. Name-dropping, status-seeking, and social climbing behavior. They're constantly trying to associate with people who will enhance their image, seeking reflected glory rather than genuine connection. The need to be desired by multiple people simultaneously. One partner's attraction isn't enough because the persona needs constant reinforcement from diverse sources. Affairs aren't about the other person. They're about collecting evidence of desirability, lack of genuine curiosity about their partner's inner world. They relate to their partner as an object that either enhances or diminishes their image, rather than as a subject with their own depth, struggles, and complexity. When you discover their affair, they're often most concerned about how this makes them look rather than the pain they've caused. The image management continues even during crisis. Jung understood this as the ego becoming possessed by the persona, the social mask eating the authentic self alive. The shadow material here is profound insecurity and shame. Beneath the inflated persona is usually a person who feels fundamentally inadequate, unlovable, or invisible. The affair temporarily medicates this wound, but because it's based on the persona rather than the self, it cannot provide genuine nourishment, hence the compulsion to repeat. This is perhaps the most dramatic and destructive pattern, when the repressed shadow erupts violently after years or decades of suppression. Jung called this enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually converts into its opposite when taken to an extreme. The person who's been good for too long becomes possessed by bad. The moral paragon becomes the transgressor. The faithful partner becomes the betrayer. This pattern often appears in religious individuals, highly controlled personalities, or people who've built their identity around being morally superior to others. The clues for shadow possession pattern: sudden, inexplicable personality changes. The person who was predictable, responsible, and morally rigid suddenly starts taking risks, breaking rules, acting impulsively. It's not a gradual shift, it's like a switch flipped. Fascination with transgression. They start watching different entertainment, reading different materials, expressing interest in topics they previously judged or avoided. The repressed material is forcing its way into consciousness. Justifications that sound like they're convincing themselves. Life is short. I deserve to be happy. Rules are meant to be broken. They're trying to override their own superego with shadow-driven rationalization, splitting between good and bad aspects of life. They maintain the appearance of the good persona in public, while engaging in increasingly extreme behavior in private. The compartmentalization is rigid and defended. Contempt for their previous values and the people who embody them. They may start mocking religion, traditional values, or commitments they once held sacred. This isn't genuine evolution. It's shadow possession masquerading as liberation. Affairs in this pattern are often reckless and self-destructive. The person makes little effort to hide the evidence because at some level they want to be caught. The psyche is staging an intervention through exposure. Jung observed that shadow possession creates enormous psychological danger because the person has no integrated ego capacity to manage the erupting material. They swing from one extreme to the other, from rigid control to complete dissolution, without finding the middle ground of conscious integration. The affair isn't really about desire or connection. It's about the shadow's revenge on the ego that imprisoned it for so long. The shadow material here is everything that was denied, repressed, or disowned in service of being good. Sexuality, aggression, spontaneity, pleasure, autonomy. When these elements erupt without integration, the result is often catastrophic for everyone involved. This is the classic Jungian scenario, and perhaps the most common pattern. The person has completely failed to develop their inner contrasexual archetype, their anima for men or animus for women, and therefore projects it entirely onto external figures. Their soul doesn't live inside them. It lives in other people. And when the primary relationship can no longer carry this projection, when their partner becomes too real, too human, too limited, the psyche begins searching for a new screen. The clues for Anima Animus projection pattern: idealization language about the affair partner. They describe this person as their soulmate, their twin flame, someone who understands them like no one else. This isn't reality, it's projection. Sudden creativity or vitality that seems disconnected from their life circumstances. The affair feels like it's bringing them alive because they're finally encountering what they think is their soul. But it's their own projected soul material reflected back. The affair feels destined or meant to be. They talk about signs from the universe, synchronicities, how they were supposed to meet. This is inflation. Archetypal energy possessing the ego and making it feel chosen, special, connected to cosmic significance. Complete inability to see the affair partner's flaws or limitations. They're relating to an archetype, not a human being. Any evidence that contradicts the ideal is dismissed or reinterpreted. The primary partner becomes increasingly demonized or devalued. It's not that they've changed, but the person needs to justify the projection transfer by making their actual partner into the villain who doesn't understand, doesn't appreciate, can't provide what they need. Sudden interest in poetry, spirituality, or expressions of longing and transcendence. The Anima, Animus projection activates the person's capacity for soul and depth, but they attribute this to the other person rather than recognizing it's their own awakening psyche. When this pattern is operative, the person genuinely believes they've found their true love, their missing half, the person who completes them. Jung would say they haven't found anything except their own projected psychology dressed in another person's body. The tragedy is that if they could integrate this anima-animus material internally, if they could develop their own capacity for soul rather than seeking it externally, they could experience this aliveness without destroying their actual relationship. But that requires consciousness, and people in the grip of projection are radically unconscious. The shadow material here is the refusal to become whole, the terror of discovering that no other person can complete you, the fear that if you develop your own soul capacities, you might have to take responsibility for your own aliveness rather than blaming your partner for your deadness. This pattern centers on using affairs as medication for deep shame and existential emptiness. The person has what Jung called a hole in the psyche, a fundamental sense of inadequacy, unworthiness, or emptiness that cannot be filled but must be constantly medicated. Affairs become a temporary balm for this wound, offering the illusion of being special, desired, significant. The clues for narcissistic wound pattern: extreme sensitivity to anything that could be interpreted as rejection or criticism. Their mood becomes entirely dependent on whether they're receiving admiration and validation. When they're not, they become dark, withdrawn, or cruel. Cycles of idealization and devaluation. They alternate between treating their partner as perfect and treating them with contempt. The partner hasn't changed, but they serve different psychological functions at different times. Inability to take responsibility for relationship problems. Everything is always someone else's fault. They lack the capacity for genuine self-reflection because that would mean facing the wound beneath the defensive structure. Compulsive need for multiple sources of validation. One affair partner isn't enough because the wound is so deep that no amount of external validation can fill it. They accumulate sexual romantic conquests like trophies. Lack of genuine empathy. They can perform empathy, but there's no authentic concern for others' inner experience. People exist primarily as objects that either feed or threaten their fragile sense of self. Affairs are often revealed through careless behavior. They leave obvious evidence not because they want to be caught, but because at some level they don't truly believe they could be abandoned. The narcissistic wound comes with a grandiose defense that assumes they're too important to lose. Jung understood this as the ego desperately trying to compensate for a severely wounded self. The person cannot tolerate ordinariness, limitation, or being genuinely known because that would expose the shame and emptiness beneath the grandiose presentation. Affairs provide temporary inflation, proof that they're special, desirable, powerful enough to transgress without consequences. But because the wound isn't healed through external validation, the relief is temporary. They need more and more intense forms of validation to achieve the same effect. The shadow material here is the terrifying suspicion that they're actually not special, not particularly lovable, fundamentally defective in some irreparable way. Rather than face this and grieve it, which could lead to authentic humility and connection, they run from it through increasingly extreme forms of validation seeking. This is the unconscious attempt to restore psychological equilibrium after feeling betrayed, abandoned, or diminished. The person may not have been overtly betrayed, but they carry a deep sense of injury from the relationship, feeling unseen, unappreciated, taken for granted, or emotionally abandoned. The affair becomes the shadow's way of balancing the scales, restoring power, or enacting justice. The clues for revenge balance pattern, long-standing resentment that's never been directly addressed. They've accumulated a catalog of grievances but haven't confronted the partner honestly. The rage builds in silence, passive-aggressive behavior escalating over time. They punish through withdrawal, forgetting, subtle sabotage of their partner's needs or plans. The affair is just the ultimate passive-aggressive act, sudden affair with someone who represents what their partner isn't. If their partner is intellectual, they choose someone physical. If their partner is stable, they choose someone dangerous. It's symbolic revenge, choosing the opposite to punish through contrast. Justifications centered on their partner's failures. If you had paid attention to me, this wouldn't have happened. They genuinely believe the affair is their partner's fault, that they were driven to it by neglect or injury, minimal guilt or remorse if discovered. Instead, there's a sense of entitlement, of finally getting what they deserved. The affair feels like justice rather than betrayal. Sometimes the unconscious structures the affair so discovery is likely. They want their partner to feel the pain they've been feeling. The revelation becomes the revenge. Jung saw this pattern as the shadow acting out the rage and hurt that the conscious ego couldn't express directly. The person couldn't say, "I'm hurt and angry and feeling abandoned," either because they lack the emotional vocabulary or because their partner was unavailable to those communications. So the psyche finds another way to communicate, another way to make the partner feel what they've been feeling. The tragedy is that this rarely brings the relief or balance the unconscious sought. Instead, it usually destroys whatever possibility existed for genuine repair. The shadow material here is the inability to be vulnerable, to name needs directly, to risk authentic confrontation rather than covert revenge. Often these individuals carry wounds from much earlier, from childhood where their needs were dismissed or where direct expression was punished. The affair becomes a repetition of that original wound and the defense against it. This is the most insidious pattern because it disguises shadow material as enlightenment. The person uses spiritual or psychological language to justify the affair, claiming it's about soul growth, authentic living, or following your truth. Affairs get reframed as soul connections, twin flames, or karmic relationships that transcend conventional morality. The clues for spiritual bypassing pattern: sudden immersion in spiritual or personal growth teachings, especially those that emphasize following your heart, breaking free from limiting beliefs, or transcending conventional relationship structures. Language that sounds evolved but functions as justification. We're all one. Love transcends commitment. The universe brought us together. My soul knew before my mind did, positioning themselves as more awakened than their partner. The partner who's hurt by the betrayal is framed as stuck in ego, unable to understand higher truths, trapped in conventional thinking, selective application of spiritual principles. They talk about authenticity and truth while maintaining elaborate deceptions. They speak of compassion but show none to their partner. They claim non-attachment while being deeply attached to the affair, surrounding themselves with others who validate the spiritual narrative. They find communities, teachers, or friends who reinforce that this affair is actually a growth opportunity, a brave choice, a path to authenticity, inability to sit with the moral complexity. Genuine spiritual maturity includes the capacity to hold paradox, to acknowledge harm, even in pursuing what feels true. Spiritual bypassing flattens this into simple narratives of liberation versus suppression. Jung warned extensively about this pattern, calling it inflation, the ego becoming possessed by archetypal or spiritual energies and mistaking this possession for genuine transformation. The person isn't individuating, they're bypassing the difficult shadow work. That genuine individuation requires facing shame, acknowledging harm, sitting with ambiguity, accepting limitation. Instead, they're using spiritual concepts as a defense against conscience, against responsibility, against the hard work of authentic integrity. The affair becomes a spiritual experience rather than a betrayal. Maintaining it becomes staying true to themselves. Hurting their partner becomes an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice for their awakening. This is perhaps the most difficult pattern to confront, because the person has an elaborate, sophisticated defense system that reframes every critique as evidence of others' lack of understanding. The shadow material here is often the deepest, a fundamental unwillingness to face their own capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and rationalization. By wrapping these qualities in spiritual language, they never have to confront them directly. While these 7 patterns are distinct, many people exhibit combinations or move between them over time. The pure might use spiritual bypassing language to justify their refusal of commitment. The narcissistic wound might drive shadow possession when the defensive structure collapses. Anima, Animus projection might be layered with revenge fantasies. The key is recognizing which archetypal configuration is primary in your situation, because it determines both the clues you'll see and the shadow work required for transformation. And here's what Jung would say is essential to understand. None of these patterns make someone fundamentally bad or irredeemable. They're all manifestations of unconscious psychological configurations that can be transformed through awareness and integration. But they can only be transformed if they're first recognized. If the person remains unconscious of which archetypal pattern has possessed them, they'll simply repeat it across multiple relationships, wondering why they keep creating the same pain. And if you're the betrayed partner, recognizing the pattern helps you withdraw your projections, understand what you're actually dealing with, and make conscious choices rather than remaining trapped in confusion about why someone who loved you could do this. The patterns aren't excuses, they're explanations. They show you that what's happening isn't personal in the way you thought. It's archetypal. Your partner isn't betraying you because you're inadequate. They're enacting an unconscious drama that would have played out regardless of who their partner was. This doesn't reduce your pain, but it can prevent you from internalizing their shadow as evidence of your unworthiness. And that distinction between understanding the archetypal pattern and taking on the shame of their behavior is crucial for your own individuation journey. Which pattern do you recognize? Which clues have you been seeing? Comment below. Sometimes naming the pattern is the first step toward consciousness. Jung warned that ignoring the clues of infidelity isn't just denial, it's a specific kind of psychological violence you commit against yourself. Every time you notice something that makes your stomach tighten and then convince yourself it's nothing, you're severing the connection between your conscious mind and your instinctual wisdom. Every time you choose the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth, you're training your psyche to distrust itself. And every time you remain in that torture space between knowing and not knowing, you're fragmenting at the deepest levels of psychological structure. Jung identified 5 escalating dangers that occur when infidelity clues are recognized by the unconscious, but refused by the conscious mind. These aren't just emotional consequences, they're structural damage to the psyche itself. The first and most insidious danger is what Jung called soul loss, the gradual disconnection from your own sense of reality, intuition, and psychological sovereignty. Here's what happens neurologically and psychologically when you repeatedly perceive something and then convince yourself you didn't. Your unconscious registers the clues. Your body responds with somatic symptoms, tension, nausea, insomnia, anxiety. Your dreams become troubled. Your intuition screams warnings. But your conscious mind rejects all of this as paranoia, insecurity, or imagination. This creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. But it's far more dangerous than simple discomfort. You're teaching your psyche that its perceptual systems can't be trusted, that your gut feelings are wrong, that your instincts are pathological. Over time, you become radically disconnected from your own knowing. Jung called this the loss of soul, because you've severed access to the deepest, most truthful parts of yourself. People in this state start questioning everything, not just their relationship, everything, their judgment about people, their professional decisions, their sense of what's real and what isn't. They'll describe feeling like they're going crazy, like they're losing their grip on reality itself, because in a very real sense they are. When the person you trust most is systematically lying to you while you simultaneously sense the truth, your psyche enters a state of profound confusion. You can't trust your partner, but you also can't trust yourself because you keep telling yourself you're wrong about what you're sensing. This double bind creates what Jung identified as a split in consciousness, where part of you knows and part of you refuses to know, and these parts can't communicate with each other. The result is dissociation, fragmentation, a kind of psychic numbing where you're present but not fully alive, aware but not fully conscious. You start living in a fog, going through motions, feeling increasingly disconnected from yourself and your life. This is why people who've experienced gaslighting, whether from a deceptive partner or from themselves, often describe it as more traumatic than the actual betrayal. The betrayal destroys trust in another person, but gaslighting destroys trust in reality itself. And when you're doing it to yourself, when you're the one dismissing your own knowing, the damage is even more profound because there's no external perpetrator to blame, no clear enemy to fight. You've become both victim and perpetrator of your own psychological dissolution. Jung observed that people in this state become increasingly vulnerable to other forms of manipulation, to depression, to existential despair. Because if you can't trust your own perception of something this fundamental, whether your partner is faithful, how can you trust your perception of anything? The soul loss manifests in concrete ways. You stop making decisions with confidence. You defer to others' judgment even about your own experience. You lose your sense of agency, feeling like things happen to you rather than feeling capable of shaping your life. Your creativity dries up because creation requires trusting your inner impulses. Your passion fades because passion requires being connected to authentic desire. You become a ghost in your own life, physically present but psychologically absent. Jung warned that this is not reversible through willpower or positive thinking. Soul loss requires soul retrieval, a deep psychological process of reconnecting with the disowned parts of yourself, learning to trust your perception again, rebuilding the bridge between conscious and unconscious knowing. But most people never do this work. They either stay fragmented or they leave the relationship without understanding what was damaged, carrying that soul loss into every future relationship. The second escalating danger is something Jung called shadow contamination, where you unconsciously absorb the unfaithful partner's shadow material and begin embodying the very energies you're trying to avoid. This is one of the most disturbing psychological mechanisms because it happens completely outside conscious awareness. Here's how it works. When your partner is being deceptive, your unconscious recognizes it even if your conscious mind denies it. That recognition creates anxiety, hypervigilance, and a desperate need to figure out what's wrong. You start monitoring their behavior more closely, checking their phone, questioning their explanations, looking for evidence, and suddenly you've become the crazy, controlling, paranoid partner. Your behavior looks pathological. You seem jealous, insecure, impossible to please. And here's the truly crazy-making part. Your partner will use your reasonable response to their betrayal as justification for the betrayal itself. You're so controlling, that's why I need space. You're so paranoid, you're pushing me away. Your jealousy is suffocating me. This is projective identification, a defense mechanism where the person projects their shadow material onto you, then relates to you as if you embody that material until you actually begin to enact it. The unfaithful partner is the one being deceptive, sneaky, and violating trust. But somehow you become the one who seems suspicious, invasive, and problematic. Jung observed this pattern constantly in his practice. The betrayed partner would come in appearing anxious, paranoid, emotionally unstable, looking for all the world like the problem in the relationship. Only after deep exploration would the truth emerge. They'd been living with gaslighting and deception for months or years, and their pathological behavior was actually a healthy psyche's response to a crazy-making situation. But by that point, enormous damage had occurred, because you're not just absorbing your partner's shadow, you're beginning to identify with it. You start to believe you really are paranoid, jealous, controlling. You internalize their projection as your identity. And even worse, you begin to feel shame about your completely appropriate response to betrayal. You apologize for being suspicious when you had every reason to be suspicious. You feel guilty for snooping when you were trying to confirm what your unconscious already knew. You work on your trust issues when the actual issue is that your partner isn't trustworthy. Jung called this the identification with the shadow of the other, and he warned it was one of the most psychologically destructive dynamics possible, because now you're not just being betrayed. You're betraying yourself by accepting their version of reality over your own. The long-term consequences are severe. You develop actual anxiety disorders from living in a state of chronic threat while being told there's no threat. You become hypervigilant in all relationships, unable to relax even with trustworthy people because your threat detection system has been recalibrated to assume danger everywhere. You lose your capacity for healthy assertion and boundary setting because you've been trained to see your own protective instincts as pathological. You become vulnerable to future manipulative relationships because you've learned to doubt your perception and defer to others' reality. And perhaps, most tragically, you may become the very thing you experienced, someone who deceives, who manipulates, who projects shadow material onto others, not because you chose to become that, but because unintegrated shadow material doesn't just disappear. It either gets integrated consciously or it starts driving your behavior unconsciously. This is why Jung said that every unmet shadow eventually becomes fate. If you don't consciously process the shadow contamination you absorbed during this relationship, it will unconsciously structure your next one. The third danger emerges when both partners become so possessed by their competing stories that they lose all connection to deeper archetypal truth. Jung observed that when infidelity is discovered or suspected, both people immediately construct elaborate narratives, stories that preserve their ego identity and justify their choices. The betrayed partner becomes the victim, innocent, wronged, morally superior. The unfaithful partner becomes the villain, selfish, weak, irredeemable. Or alternatively, the unfaithful partner becomes the misunderstood seeker, brave, authentic, finally living their truth. The betrayed partner becomes the oppressor, controlling, cold, the reason they had to seek connection elsewhere. These narratives aren't necessarily wrong. They contain elements of truth. But when they become inflated, when they're the only story, the complete story, the story that admits no complexity, they become more dangerous than the original betrayal. because now both people are completely possessed by archetypal victim-villain dynamics. Neither can see the other as a full human being with shadow and light, wounds and strengths, consciousness and unconsciousness. Neither can see themselves accurately either, their own shadow, their own participation in the relational dynamics, their own unlived life seeking expression. The relationship becomes a battlefield of competing egos, each fighting to have their narrative validated, neither willing to descend into the messy, ambiguous truth that lives below the surface stories. Jung warned that this inflation is particularly dangerous because it feels righteous. If you're the betrayed partner, your victim narrative protects you from having to look at how you might have checked out emotionally, how you might have been projecting your animus anima onto your partner, how you might have been choosing safety over aliveness long before any affair occurred. If you're the unfaithful partner, your liberation narrative protects you from having to face your cowardice, your cruelty, your capacity for self-deception and rationalization. Both narratives prevent individuation. Both keep you trapped in ego identification rather than opening to self. And the longer you remain in these inflated positions, the more psychological damage accrues, because you're not processing the actual experience. You're processing the story about the experience. You're not grieving the real loss. You're maintaining the narrative that explains the loss in a way that preserves your ego. You're not integrating shadow material. You're projecting it entirely onto the other person. The betrayed partner's inflation often manifests as obsessive focus on every detail of the betrayal, interrogating, analyzing, reviewing the timeline over and over. This isn't actually about getting answers. It's about avoiding the deeper questions about self that the betrayal raises, sharing the story widely and repeatedly to receive validation, building a case, collecting witnesses to confirm the narrative. This provides temporary relief, but prevents the descent into actual grief and shadow work, moral superiority that becomes its own prison. I would never do what they did becomes the foundation of identity, but this superiority prevents examining one's own shadow capacity for betrayal in all its forms, making the betrayal the central story of your life. Years later, you're still introducing yourself through this wound, still defining yourself by what was done to you, rather than who you're becoming. The unfaithful partner's inflation often manifests as elaborate justifications that sound like therapy speak, using psychological or spiritual language to avoid simple accountability. I was seeking wholeness instead of I was being selfish and cowardly. Impatience with the betrayed partner's pain. When are you going to move on? I've apologized already. How long are you going to punish me? This is ego inflation, expecting to be absolved without having to genuinely descend into the shame and grief their choices created, positioning themselves as the real victim. You don't understand how hard this is for me. I'm losing everything. This isn't entirely wrong. Consequences are painful, but it becomes inflation when they center their pain while minimizing their partners, moving quickly into a new relationship and calling it healing. I've learned so much from this. I'm a different person now. Except they've learned nothing because they never stopped long enough to face their shadow. Jung said that both of these inflations serve the same function, avoiding the death experience that genuine transformation requires. The betrayed partner would have to die to their innocence, their victim identity, their projection that they were in a secure relationship with a trustworthy person. The unfaithful partner would have to die to their innocence, their self-image as a good person, their fantasy that they can act without consequences or that their shadow doesn't exist. Neither wants to die, so both stay inflated. The relationship becomes a frozen tableau of victim and villain, each holding their position, neither transforming. And if they divorce, still trapped in these narratives, They'll recreate the same dynamics in their next relationships, because the inflation isn't about the other person. It's about refusing to face what this experience reveals about your own psyche, your own shadow, your own unlived life. The fourth danger is perhaps the most heartbreaking. Children absorb the split-off psychic material and unconsciously inherit patterns of betrayal, mistrust, and fragmented relating. Jung understood that children are extraordinarily sensitive to the unconscious material in their environment. They don't just observe the obvious drama, the arguments, the tension, the discovery, the aftermath. They absorb the psychological atmosphere, the energetic field, the split between what's being said and what's actually happening. And when parents are navigating infidelity, especially when they're trying to hide it, deny it, or minimize it, children internalize something toxic. That reality isn't trustworthy, that adults lie, even about the most important things, that you can't trust your perceptions because everyone is pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. Research in attachment theory and developmental psychology confirms what Jung intuited. Children who grow up in households marked by infidelity, even if they don't consciously know about the affair, show specific patterns. They develop anxious or disorganized attachment styles. They learn that relationships aren't safe, that people who claim to love you can betray you, that commitment is performative rather than real. They become hypervigilant to emotional inconsistency. They're scanning faces, reading energy, trying to figure out what's really happening beneath the surface presentation. This creates exhausting hypervigilance that often continues into adulthood. They struggle to trust their own instincts about people. They've been trained that what they sense, tension, dishonesty, disconnection, isn't real because the adults keep insisting everything is fine. They develop shame about their perceptual capacities. When you repeatedly notice something is wrong and are implicitly or explicitly told you're imagining it, you learn to pathologize your own accurate perception. Jung called this the sins of the fathers visited upon the sons. Not through genetics, but through the transmission of unconscious psychological material. Children don't need to be told about the affair to be damaged by it. They absorb the psychic atmosphere of deception, fragmentation, and denied reality, and they carry that atmospheric poison into their own adult relationships. The daughter who watched her mother ignore obvious clues of her father's infidelity may become a woman who tolerates deception in her own relationships, unconsciously reenacting her mother's denial. Or she might become the opposite, hypervigilant to any sign of betrayal, unable to trust even trustworthy partners, recreating the anxiety she absorbed as a child. The son who absorbed his father's split between public persona and private betrayal may become a man who compartmentalizes, similarly maintaining a good guy image while engaging in shadow behavior he never consciously decided to enact. Or he might become paralyzed by the fear of becoming like his father, so terrified of his own shadow that he can't access his healthy masculine capacity for desire and assertion. This is how trauma becomes generational, not through direct teaching but through atmospheric absorption. The children don't learn that infidelity is acceptable. They learn something worse, that reality is untrustworthy, that their perceptions are wrong, that the people who claim to love them maintain profound secrets, that relationships operate on false presentations rather than genuine intimacy. And these lessons structure their psychology in ways that are incredibly difficult to unravel. Jung saw clients in their 40s, 50s, 60s who were still unconsciously enacting relational patterns they'd absorbed in childhood from parents' unresolved infidelity, patterns they'd never consciously chosen but couldn't seem to break. The only way to prevent this transmission is radical honesty and conscious processing. If parents can acknowledge what happened, face their own shadow material, do genuine integration work, and help their children process the experience age appropriately. The trauma can be contained rather than transmitted. But most people don't do this. They hide the affair from the children, maintain the fiction that everything is fine, and unconsciously pass on all their unprocessed material to the next generation. This is why Jung said that individuation isn't just personal work, it's ethical obligation. Every piece of shadow material you refuse to integrate, you hand to your children to carry. Every projection you refuse to withdraw, you teach them to maintain. Every time you choose comfortable lies over painful truth, you train them to do the same. And the cycle continues until someone has the courage to break it through consciousness. The fifth and ultimate danger is what Jung called psychological death. When the betrayed partner closes off their capacity for trust, vulnerability, and deep relating entirely. This is foreclosure of the soul, the death of the capacity for genuine connection. The person remains physically alive but psychologically entombed. Here's how it happens. After being betrayed, especially if the clues were ignored for a long time, especially if the gaslighting was severe, especially if multiple betrayals occurred, the psyche makes a calculation. Never again will I be that vulnerable. Never again will I trust that deeply. Never again will I open myself to that kind of devastation. This feels like self-protection, and in the short term, it is. The walls go up, the defenses strengthen, the heart becomes armored. You can still function, still work, parent, socialize, still even date or remarry, but something essential has been sealed off. Jung called it the closing of the individuation path, when the soul stops risking, stops growing, stops reaching for genuine connection because the price feels too high. You become what Jung described as successfully defended, but psychologically dead. The danger signals are subtle because they often look like strength. You become proudly self-sufficient. You don't need anyone. You've learned to rely only on yourself. But this isn't healthy autonomy. It's defended isolation disguised as independence. You choose safe, surface relationships, partners who don't threaten you because they never truly reach you. You're technically in relationship, but never genuinely vulnerable. You become cynical about love, romance, or deep partnership. You call it being realistic, but it's actually being closed. You've decided that the stories about real intimacy are lies, and you're too smart to be fooled again. You intellectualize everything. You analyze relationships, deconstruct emotions, explain away feelings. The mind becomes a fortress protecting you from the heart's vulnerability. You feel relief at being alone, not healthy solitude, defended relief that no one can hurt you, betray you, disappoint you. The walls feel like freedom because you've forgotten what genuine connection feels like. Jung warned that this foreclosure is a kind of death because it stops the individuation process completely. Individuation requires vulnerability, requires risking, requires opening to the other, both the other person and the other within yourself, the unconscious, the shadow, the parts you've denied. When you close yourself off to protect against future betrayal, you don't just close off to danger, you close off to aliveness itself. The tragic irony is that this defense often feels like wisdom. I've learned my lesson. I'm not naive anymore. I see people clearly now. I won't be fooled again. But what you've actually learned is how to avoid, rather than how to be with complexity. You've learned how to stay safe, rather than how to stay alive. Jung saw countless people who survived betrayal but never truly lived again. They found stability, security, predictability. They avoided risk and therefore avoided devastation. But they also avoided joy, depth, genuine intimacy, and the transformative power of true connection. They became ghosts walking through their own lives, present but not participating, defended but not alive. And here's what makes this foreclosure so insidious. it often doesn't feel like a problem. After the pain of betrayal, this defended state feels like relief, even happiness. I'm finally at peace. I don't need anyone. I'm content with my life as it is. But Jung would ask, is that peace or is it the quiet of the grave? Is that contentment or is it resignation? Is that strength or is it the kind of hardness that comes from sealing off the parts of yourself that could feel, risk, and connect? Because genuine peace, the kind that comes from integration rather than defense, includes capacity for vulnerability. Real strength, the kind that comes from having faced your shadow and survived, includes the courage to remain open. True wisdom, the kind that individuation produces, includes the ability to discern between healthy and unhealthy relationships without closing yourself off to relationship itself. Existential foreclosure looks like protection but functions as prison. You've saved yourself from future betrayal by making yourself unavailable for future connection. You've protected your heart by burying it alive. And the most heartbreaking aspect of this danger is that it often remains unconscious. People don't realize they've foreclosed. They think they're fine. They might even think they're healed. They've moved on. They've processed it. They're in a good place. But if you look closely, there's a deadness behind the eyes, a quality of defended distance, a life that's organized around avoiding rather than approaching. Jung's message was urgent. If you've been betrayed and you're starting to feel this foreclosure happening, if you're starting to build those permanent walls, if you're starting to believe that connection isn't worth the risk, you need immediate psychological intervention, not to force yourself to trust again, not to bypass the legitimate need for protection and discernment, but to ensure that your protection doesn't become your prison, to ensure that your response to one person's betrayal doesn't become a life sentence of isolation, to ensure that you transform the experience rather than letting it deform you. Because Jung discovered something radical. Betrayal can either close you or crack you open. It can either make you hard or make you deep. It can either end your capacity for connection or initiate you into a more conscious, discerning, authentic form of relating. But that second path, the path of transformation rather than foreclosure, requires facing all 5 of these dangers directly. It requires acknowledging the soul loss and doing retrieval work. It requires recognizing shadow contamination and doing shadow integration. It requires deflating the competing narratives and descending into complex truth. It requires preventing generational transmission through radical honesty and conscious processing. And it requires staying open, not naively, but courageously, to the possibility that genuine connection is still possible even after devastating betrayal. Most people don't do this work. They choose the safer path of foreclosure. And Jung grieved for them because he understood what they'd lost. Not just one relationship, but their capacity for genuine relating itself. The ultimate danger of unrecognized infidelity isn't the betrayal. It's what you become if you refuse to face it consciously. That's the real tragedy. That's the real death. Jung's approach to infidelity was radical for his time and remains so today. He refused to simply pathologize the unfaithful partner or sanctify the betrayed one. He refused to offer simplistic advice like, once a cheater, always a cheater, or you must forgive to heal. Instead, he presented something far more demanding and far more transformative. He positioned infidelity as a potential initiation into individuation for both partners, not an excuse, an opportunity, not a justification, a portal. The affair has already happened. The psyche has already fractured. The shadow has already erupted. The only question now is, will this crisis destroy you, or will it become the catalyst for the most profound transformation of your life? Jung's solution isn't a quick fix. It's a complete psychological reorientation that unfolds through 5 critical stages. The first and most crucial step is withdrawing your projections, and this applies to both partners. For the betrayed partner, this sounds counterintuitive, even offensive. I'm the one who was betrayed. Why do I need to withdraw projections? I'm not the one who did anything. Wrong. Jung would respond, you're absolutely right that you didn't cause the betrayal. Your partner's choices are their responsibility. But if you want transformation rather than just trauma, if you want to become more whole rather than more wounded, you must ask painful questions about your own projections. What have you been projecting onto this relationship? Completeness? The idea that a partner could fill the holes in your psyche that only internal development can fill. Safety? The fantasy that commitment means protection from heartbreak, that vows create guarantees. Your unlived life? Did you project your animus or anima entirely onto your partner, making them responsible for your aliveness, your creativity, your spiritual vitality? Jung wasn't suggesting the betrayed partner caused the affair through these projections. He was saying that every relationship contains unconscious material from both people, and betrayal forces that material into consciousness, whether you're ready or not. The temptation is to remain in pure victim consciousness. I am entirely innocent. They are entirely guilty. I need only to decide whether to forgive them or leave them. But victim consciousness, while containing emotional truth, prevents psychological growth. It keeps you trapped in a binary where your healing depends on what the other person does, whether they grovel sufficiently, whether they do the work, whether they somehow earn their way back into your good graces. Jung would say, your healing cannot depend on their behavior. That gives them too much power and you too little agency. Instead, ask, what was I refusing to see? What was I unwilling to feel? What authentic parts of myself was I suppressing to maintain this relationship? Emma, in our earlier case study, discovered she'd been projecting her animus onto David for years, expecting him to carry her ambition, her assertion, her capacity for risk-taking. When he became unavailable for that projection because he was projecting his anima onto Rachel, Emma's psyche started screaming, not because David was all she needed, because she'd made him responsible for parts of herself she needed to develop internally. Recognizing this didn't make her responsible for his affair, but it did make her responsible for her own individuation. For the unfaithful partner, withdrawing projections is even more crucial and even more difficult. You must recognize that the affair partner isn't actually your soulmate, your twin flame, or the answer to your existential longing. They're a screen for your own projected anima or animus, the soul material you haven't developed internally. That intoxicating feeling of finally being understood, that's you recognizing your own unconscious material reflected back to you. That sense of coming alive in their presence, that's your own vitality that's been dormant, now activated, but it's your vitality, not theirs. The affair partner seems special because they're carrying your disowned psychological material, but they're not actually special in the way you think. They're functionally interchangeable with anyone else who could serve as that projection screen. This is perhaps the most difficult truth for someone in affair fog to accept. The possession feels so real, so destined, so cosmically significant. But Jung would say, that sense of cosmic significance is correct. You are encountering something sacred. You're just wrong about where it's located. It's not in the other person. It's in your own psyche, finally stirring toward wholeness. If you could recognize that and begin integrating your anima or animus internally, you wouldn't need the affair partner at all. You could experience that aliveness, that vitality, that sense of soul in yourself, in your actual life, possibly even in your committed relationship if both partners are willing to do this work. But as long as you believe the magic is in the other person, you'll chase projection after projection, destroying relationship after relationship, never achieving the wholeness you're actually seeking. The second stage requires both partners to face how they contributed to the relational deadness that made the psyche vulnerable to splitting. This is not about blame, it's about psychological honesty. For the betrayed partner, this means acknowledging ways you may have been emotionally unavailable, sexually withdrawn, or unconsciously checked out of the relationship long before any physical betrayal occurred. Maybe you stopped desiring your partner years ago, but never said anything. Maybe you stayed in the relationship for practical reasons, kids, finances, fear of being alone, while your heart was elsewhere. Maybe you were so consumed by other priorities, career, children, extended family, that the relationship became an afterthought. None of this justifies your partner's choice to betray rather than confront, but it does explain how the relational field became vulnerable to shadow eruption. Jung observed that dead relationships don't happen in a vacuum. Both people participate in the killing, usually unconsciously, usually through 1,000 small withdrawals rather than any dramatic rejection. And if you can't acknowledge your participation in the relational deadness, you'll likely recreate it in your next relationship. You'll bring the same patterns, the same emotional unavailability, the same projection, the same refusal to prioritize genuine intimacy, and wonder why you attract partners who betray you. For the unfaithful partner, shadow integration means facing your capacity for deception, cowardice, and cruelty, not the sanitized version where you were confused or going through something or didn't mean to hurt anyone. The raw version, you chose self-gratification over integrity. You chose temporary pleasure over honoring your commitments. You chose to let your partner suffer in confusion rather than risk the discomfort of honest confrontation. You must face that you're capable of profound selfishness, that you can rationalize almost anything when it serves your desires, that you can watch someone you claim to love disintegrate from your lies and still maintain those lies to protect your own comfort. This is your shadow, and until you integrate it, until you can hold the truth that you're capable of this kind of harm, you'll repeat it. You'll tell yourself this was an aberration, a one-time mistake, something that happened because of special circumstances. But Jung knew better. This wasn't an aberration. This was your shadow asserting itself because you've been refusing to acknowledge its existence. Integrating shadow doesn't mean wallowing in shame or self-punishment. It means accepting the full spectrum of your psychological reality, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, capable of love and capable of destruction. Only when you can hold both can you make genuinely conscious choices about your behavior rather than remaining at the mercy of unconscious forces. The third stage is the most alchemically powerful, reclaiming your contrasexual archetype from external projection. For men, this means developing the anima internally, learning to access feeling, emotional depth, relational capacity, and connection to soul without needing a woman to carry those qualities for you. For women, this means developing the animus internally, learning to access assertion, clarity, directed will, and spiritual authority without needing a man to embody those qualities for you. This work is identical regardless of the gender of your partner or your own sexual orientation. The principle is the same. Stop seeking your wholeness through another person and begin developing it within yourself. Jung provided specific practices for this reclamation. Active imagination with your anima, animus. This involves dialoguing with the inner figure, asking what it wants, what it needs, what it's been trying to communicate through the affair or through your response to being betrayed. Men might imagine their anima, often appearing as a woman in dreams or fantasy, and ask, "What have you been seeking? What part of my soul have I been neglecting? What do you need from me?" Women might imagine their animus, often appearing as a man or multiple men, representing different masculine capacities, and ask, what power of mine have I been giving away? What strength have I failed to claim? What do you need me to become? These aren't just therapeutic exercises. Jung understood them as genuine encounters with autonomous aspects of the psyche that have been split off and projected externally, creative expression of contrasexual energy. For men, this might mean returning to poetry, music, art, or any practice that develops feeling capacity and soul connection. For women, this might mean pursuing intellectual rigor, developing professional authority, or engaging in practices that strengthen will and directed action. The key is engaging with the qualities you've been projecting onto your partner or affair partner, discovering that you can develop them yourself. Shadow work around gender socialization. Much of our inability to integrate the contrasexual archetype comes from cultural conditioning about what's appropriate for our gender. Men are taught that emotional depth, vulnerability, and soul attention are feminine and therefore threatening to masculinity. Women are taught that assertion, ambition, and intellectual authority are masculine and therefore threatening to femininity. These cultural stories create the splits that make projection necessary. Reclaiming the anima animus requires confronting these internalized cultural messages and developing the forbidden capacities anyway. Somatic integration. The anima animus isn't just psychological, it has bodily resonance. Men might practice allowing themselves to feel vulnerable, to cry, to be uncertain, to soften, experiencing these states somatically rather than just intellectually acknowledging them. Women might practice taking up space physically, using powerful voice, making direct eye contact, embodying strength, not performing masculine behavior but accessing genuine feminine power that cultural conditioning suppressed. This reclamation work is transformative because it achieves what the affair was unconsciously seeking: wholeness. The person who successfully integrates their anima or animus no longer needs to project it onto external figures. They carry their own soul. They access their own completion. They relate to others from fullness rather than emptiness. And paradoxically, this is when genuine intimacy becomes possible. When you stop needing another person to complete you, you can finally choose them freely. When you stop projecting your anima animus, you can finally see the actual human being in front of you. When you're whole, you can engage in authentic relationship rather than unconscious projection. The fourth stage involves moving beyond binary thinking into what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox without collapsing into either-or thinking. After infidelity, people get trapped in binaries. Should I stay or should I leave? Should I forgive or should I punish? Are they fundamentally bad, or was this a mistake they can recover from? Am I strong if I leave, or am I strong if I stay? Jung would say all of these are ego questions. They're the conscious mind trying to resolve unbearable ambiguity through decisive action. But genuine transformation requires sitting in the ambiguity longer. It requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, remaining in the unbearable space where you can't yet know the right answer, where both staying and leaving seem impossible, where every option feels like betrayal of something essential. This isn't indecision, it's psychological maturation. The ego wants resolution. The self knows that premature resolution prevents the deeper transformation that only ambiguity can produce. In that space of not knowing, something new can emerge, what Jung called the third position, not staying as you were, not leaving as you thought you would, but a third possibility that couldn't have been imagined from the either-or position. Maybe it's staying, but in a completely restructured relationship where both people have individuated and are choosing each other freshly rather than remaining out of fear or obligation. Maybe it's leaving, but not from woundedness, leaving from clarity, from self. from genuine recognition that individuation requires separation. Maybe it's something else entirely, a creative reconfiguration that honors both people's truth without requiring either to violate their integrity. But you can't access this third position by rushing to decision. You access it by staying in the fire long enough for something to be forged that couldn't have existed before. This requires enormous psychological strength, the ability to tolerate uncertainty, to resist pressure, both internal and external, to just decide already, to trust that the self will reveal the path when the time is right. Most people can't do this. They collapse into one pole or the other out of sheer anxiety. They either stay unconsciously out of fear or leave unconsciously out of rage, never accessing the conscious choice that could have emerged from patient endurance of ambiguity. Jung's invitation is different. Wait, feel everything. Let the opposites tear at you. Let the ambiguity be excruciating. Don't act from ego desperation. Wait for the self to speak, and when it does, you'll know. Not because you figured it out logically, because something has shifted at a level deeper than thought. The decision won't be made by your wounded ego or your defended persona. It will emerge from your authentic center, from the part of you that knows truth beyond rationalization or fear. The final stage is perhaps the most crucial, recognizing that this crisis is an initiation, and initiations require death. Death of the naive self that believed relationships were safe. Death of the illusion that you can control whether people betray you. Death of the fantasy that another person can complete you. Death of the old relationship, regardless of whether it technically continues. Jung was clear, there is no transformation without destruction, no rebirth without death, no individuation without the dismemberment of the old self. And infidelity, whether experienced as the betrayed or the betrayer, is one of the most complete dismemberments available. It destroys your identity, your worldview, your sense of reality, your trust in perception, your faith in commitment, your understanding of yourself and your partner. Everything gets shattered, and the temptation is to immediately start rebuilding, to gather up the pieces and reassemble something that looks like what you had before. But Jung would say, don't rebuild yet. Stay in the ruins longer. Let the fire burn away everything that was false. Let the destruction be complete. Let yourself be unmade fully before you attempt to remake. This is the opposite of what modern psychology usually recommends. We're told to heal quickly, to move forward, to not let this define us. But Jung understood that some experiences should define us, should fundamentally restructure who we are, should mark a before and after in our psychological development. Infidelity is one of those experiences, not because of the physical act, because of what it forces into consciousness about projection, shadow, the fragility of trust, the depth of human capacity for self-deception. Embracing the transformative fire means allowing the complete grief, not just sadness about the betrayal, but grief for the death of your innocent self, the self that believed in simple narratives, the self that thought you could avoid this kind of pain through good behavior. Sitting with the shame. For the betrayed partner, shame that you didn't see it coming, that you ignored your instincts, that you somehow let this happen. For the unfaithful partner, shame about your capacity for cruelty, deception, and selfishness. This shame isn't something to quickly overcome. It's information. It's the psyche's response to violating your own values or having reality violate your worldview. Feeling the rage fully, not acting it out destructively, but allowing yourself to feel the murderous fury that betrayal activates. This rage is often terrifying to conscious ego, but it's essential shadow material that must be acknowledged. Experiencing the terror, the existential vertigo of recognizing that you can't ultimately control whether people betray you. That trust is always a risk. That certainty is always an illusion, enduring the meaninglessness, the period where everything feels pointless, where you can't remember why you bothered with relationships at all, where the whole enterprise of intimate partnership seems like a cosmic joke. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, and he insisted it was a necessary passage, because on the other side of complete dissolution lies the possibility of genuine reconstruction, not rebuilding what was, creating what could be, a self that's been through the fire and emerged transformed, a person capable of relating without projection, loving without possession, trusting without naivety, committing without self-abandonment, someone who can hold complexity, who can acknowledge their shadow, who can be vulnerable without being destroyed by vulnerability. This is the gift hidden inside betrayal, but you only receive it if you embrace the fire rather than running from it. Most people run. They numb with substances, work, new relationships, immediate forgiveness that bypasses grief, or immediate divorce that bypasses integration. All of these are ways of escaping the transformative fire before it can complete its work. Jung's radical invitation is different. Stay in it. Let it burn. Let it destroy everything that was false. Trust that what survives the fire is real. Trust that what emerges from the ashes is more authentically you than anything that existed before. This is the individuation response to betrayal, not a technique, not a process with guaranteed outcomes, a complete reorientation toward crisis as opportunity, toward death as prerequisite for rebirth, toward the worst thing that's happened as potential portal to the most profound transformation of your life. It requires courage most people don't have. It requires psychological capacity most people haven't developed. It requires faith in something beyond ego, faith in the self, in the psyche's inherent drive toward wholeness, in the transformative power of conscious suffering. But for those who can walk this path, what Jung discovered is extraordinary. The betrayal stops being the defining trauma and becomes one chapter in a larger story of awakening. The person who betrayed you stops being the villain of your narrative and becomes the catalyst for your individuation. The relationship that ended or transformed stops being a failure and becomes the crucible where you were forged into something more real. This doesn't mean you're grateful for the betrayal, doesn't mean it didn't hurt, doesn't mean it was somehow meant to be. It means you used it, you metabolized it, you transformed poison into medicine, and that, Jung understood, is what separates those who survive from those who truly live. Which path will you choose? Jung understood that humanity has been grappling with infidelity since the dawn of pair bonding. Every culture, every era, every mythology contains stories of betrayal, and these stories reveal the two fundamental paths: destruction through unconsciousness or transformation through integration. Let's examine both. The Arthurian legend isn't just medieval romance. It's a psychological map of what happens when betrayal triggers ego inflation, revenge fantasies, and collective shadow possession rather than individual awakening. Arthur discovers that his wife Guinevere and his most trusted knight Lancelot have betrayed him. The affair isn't just personal. It threatens the entire symbolic structure he's built. Camelot represents ideal kingship, perfect fellowship, sacred order. The betrayal reveals that this perfection was always illusion. But instead of using this revelation for psychological integration, Arthur and his kingdom collapse into unconscious reaction. Arthur becomes possessed by the archetype of the betrayed king. His identity fuses with the wound. His primary concern becomes restoring his honor through punishment rather than understanding the deeper truth the affair reveals. Lancelot and Guinevere become possessed by guilt and forbidden love, unable to integrate the shadow material their affair expressed. And the Knights of the Round Table split into factions, each projecting good and evil onto the various players rather than recognizing the collective shadow material seeking expression. Jung would say, this is what happens when crisis triggers persona defense rather than individuation work. Arthur cannot admit that his Camelot was built on repression, of sexuality, of human complexity, of shadow. His perfect kingdom required everyone to perform impossible purity. Guinevere and Lancelot's affair was the shadow's rebellion against this impossible standard. But instead of seeing this, instead of asking what the affair revealed about the collective psychology of Camelot, everyone collapses into archetypal positions: victim, villain, loyal defender, betrayer. The result is complete destruction. The round table dissolves, the fellowship splinters. Arthur and Mordred, his shadow son from incestuous union, another repressed shadow element, kill each other in final battle. Camelot falls not because of the affair itself, but because everyone remained unconscious about what the affair meant. The betrayal became the poison that destroyed everything, rather than the medicine that could have initiated collective awakening. This is the warning pattern. This is what happens when betrayal is met with unconsciousness. You can trace this pattern through history. Royal families destroyed by infidelity scandals, where the focus was entirely on maintaining appearances, controlling the narrative, punishing transgressors, never on examining the psychological and systemic conditions that made betrayal inevitable. Religious communities shattered by affairs of trusted leaders, where the response was cover-up or excommunication, rather than examining the shadow material of sexual repression, power dynamics, and spiritual bypassing. Family systems fractured across generations, where one infidelity creates permanent rifts, competing narratives, tribal loyalties, everyone remaining unconscious about their own participation in the family shadow. The pattern is always the same. Betrayal is treated as an external event to be managed rather than as a symptom of collective unconsciousness. People collapse into archetypal victim-villain roles rather than using the crisis for shadow work. The focus becomes punishment, revenge, or restoration of the previous structure rather than transformation into something more conscious. And the result is always destruction of relationships, of communities, of psychological possibilities. Now contrast this with a very different response to betrayal. Nelson Mandela experienced multiple profound betrayals during his life, by the apartheid government that imprisoned him for 27 years, by fellow prisoners who collaborated with authorities, by some comrades in the ANC who prioritized personal power over liberation, and even in his personal relationships. His first wife, Evelyn, left him, unable to cope with his commitment to activism. His second wife, Winnie's affairs and political choices while he was imprisoned were publicly humiliating betrayals. Any of these could have made Mandela bitter, vengeful, permanently hardened. Instead, he became one of the most psychologically integrated political leaders in human history. How? By consistently choosing consciousness over unconsciousness when faced with betrayal. Jung would recognize Mandela's psychological work as a near-perfect example of the individuation response to betrayal. First, he withdrew projections. Mandela refused to see his betrayers as simply evil or himself as simply righteous. He recognized the humanity in those who imprisoned him, understanding their unconsciousness rather than just their cruelty. He wrote, "I knew that people expected me to harbor anger toward whites, but I had none. In prison, my anger toward whites decreased, but my hatred for the system grew." This is sophisticated psychological differentiation, separating the system from the individuals, refusing simple projection of evil onto people, directing his moral clarity toward structures while maintaining connection to shared humanity. Second, he integrated his shadow. Mandela acknowledged his own capacity for violence, for rage, for revenge fantasies. He didn't repress these elements, he consciously chose not to act from them. This is crucial. He felt the rage fully but didn't become possessed by it. He acknowledged his desire for vengeance but made a conscious choice toward reconciliation instead. This isn't spiritual bypassing. This is shadow integration, knowing you could destroy but choosing not to, not from weakness but from strength. Third, he reclaimed his psychological sovereignty. Mandela didn't make his healing dependent on his betrayer's behavior. He didn't wait for apologies, for acknowledgement, for external validation. He did his own work. He developed his own capacity for psychological wholeness, independently of whether those who harmed him ever admitted wrongdoing. This is what Jung meant by individuation. You become whole regardless of what others do. Fourth, he transcended the opposites. Mandela refused the binary of forgive or seek revenge. Instead, he created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a third position that honored both justice and mercy, both accountability and forgiveness. This wasn't weak compromise. It was psychological sophistication that could hold paradox without collapsing into either extreme. Fifth, he embraced the transformative fire. Mandela used his 27 years in prison, an experience that would destroy most people, as a crucible for transformation. He didn't just survive. He consciously used the suffering to burn away ego inflation, to develop humility, to cultivate patience, to deepen his understanding of human psychology. He emerged not hardened but refined, not closed but deepened, not destroyed but transformed. The result was extraordinary. Mandela led South Africa through a transition that every political scientist predicted would end in civil war. Instead, he created the conditions for fragile but genuine reconciliation, not because he was naive about betrayal, because he was psychologically mature enough to respond to betrayal with consciousness rather than unconscious reaction. Jung would say, Mandela achieved what Camelot could not. He used betrayal as initiation into deeper wisdom rather than trigger for unconscious destruction. But perhaps the most intimate example of transformation through betrayal comes from Jung himself. Jung's relationship with infidelity was deeply personal and profoundly problematic by conventional standards. He maintained long-term relationships with both Sabina Spielrein and Tony Wolff. While married to Emma Jung, these weren't brief affairs. They were sustained, intimate connections that lasted years and caused enormous pain to everyone involved. Jung could have avoided this topic in his work, could have maintained the persona of the wise analyst who had transcended such messy human failings. Instead, he used his own experience as primary material for psychological investigation. The Red Book, Jung's private journal during his near-psychotic break from 1913-1916, contains excruciating passages where he confronts his capacity for betrayal, his inflation, and his shadow's cruelty. He writes of encountering a figure he calls the devil, who forces him to acknowledge, "You thought you were above this. You thought your spiritual aspirations made you different from ordinary men who betray their wives. But you are not different. You are capable of profound selfishness, disguised as service to the self." Jung didn't excuse himself. He didn't claim his affairs were necessary for his individuation, though some later Jungians have tried to make this argument. He sat in the unbearable truth. He had caused enormous suffering to people he loved. He had violated his own values. He had acted from unconscious possession rather than conscious choice. And this confrontation nearly destroyed him psychologically. His confrontation with the unconscious during this period wasn't just about encountering archetypal figures. It was about facing the truth of his own shadow, his inflation, his use of women to carry his anima rather than developing it internally, his intellectual rationalizations for behavior that was simply hurtful. But here's what makes Jung's journey instructive. He stayed in that fire. He didn't immediately try to fix things, to apologize his way out, to create a new narrative that would restore his self-image. He let himself be dismembered by the truth of what he'd done. And in that dismemberment, something profound happened. Jung began to understand anima projection, not just theoretically, but experientially. He recognized that he'd been seeking his soul in women's bodies because he hadn't learned to access it internally. He began to understand shadow possession, how the part of himself he'd disowned as unspiritual had erupted through affairs demanding recognition. He began to understand the difference between the ego's desire for comfort and the self's demand for transformation. And slowly, painfully, he began to integrate what he'd been acting out. He developed his anima internally through active imagination, through creative work, through descent into his own unconscious rather than projecting it onto external women. He faced his shadow material about power, about using his analytical position to justify behavior that was exploitative, about his capacity for cruelty disguised as psychological necessity. He withdrew his inflation, recognizing he wasn't a spiritual exception to human limitation. The result was Jung's most mature work, his later writings on individuation, on the self, on the integration of opposites. All of this came through the crucible of his own reckoning with betrayal, both as perpetrator and as husband trying to integrate what his affairs revealed about his psyche. Emma Jung, too, did remarkable psychological work during this period. She could have collapsed into permanent victimhood or divorced Jung and built her identity around his betrayal. Instead, she withdrew her own projections, recognizing she'd been projecting her animus onto Jung, expecting him to carry her psychological development rather than pursuing it herself. She developed her own analytical practice. She wrote her own work on the anima. She individuated separately from Jung, no longer depending on him for her psychological wholeness, and in doing so, their marriage transformed. Not back to what it was. That relationship died, but into something more conscious, where both were relating from self rather than projection, from wholeness rather than neediness. This doesn't make Jung's affairs acceptable, doesn't mean Emma wasn't hurt, doesn't suggest this is a model to emulate. It demonstrates that even the most painful betrayals can become initiations if both people have the courage to face what the crisis reveals about their own unconscious material. What separates the Camelot pattern from the Mandela Jung pattern? Consciousness. When betrayal is met with unconscious reaction, projection, inflation, victim-villain dynamics, refusal of shadow work, it destroys everything it touches. When betrayal is met with conscious response, withdrawal of projections, shadow integration, reclamation of sovereignty, transcendence of opposites, it becomes transformative. The betrayal is the same. The pain is the same. The shattering is the same. The difference is what you do in the midst of the shattering. Do you collapse into archetypal possession, becoming the betrayed victim, or the guilty transgressor, or the righteous judge? Or do you use the crisis as Jung did, as raw material for the most profound psychological work of your life? Most people choose unconsciousness because it's easier, because it provides clear narratives and defined roles, because it doesn't require the excruciating work of examining your own shadow. But Jung's message is unambiguous. If you choose unconsciousness in response to betrayal, you'll remain trapped in its destructive patterns, either in this relationship or in the next one, either overtly or covertly, either as victim or perpetrator. Only consciousness sets you free, not from pain, from repetition, not from consequences, from unconscious compulsion, not from the past, from being forever possessed by the past. That's The choice betrayal forces, destruction or transformation, unconsciousness or individuation, Camelot or Mandela. Which path will you walk? Let's descend deeper into Jung's personal crucible, because understanding his struggles with infidelity, projection, and shadow possession isn't just biographical interest. It's essential to comprehending why his framework for recognizing and responding to betrayal has such profound psychological precision. He wasn't speaking theoretically. He was speaking from the ruins of his own life. It began in 1904 when Sabina Spielrein, a 19-year-old patient suffering from what was then called hysteria, was admitted to the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital where Jung worked. Jung was 29, newly married to Emma, already establishing himself as Freud's most promising protégé. Sabina was brilliant, troubled, erotically charged. Jung became fascinated with her case, convinced he could cure her through the new psychoanalytic methods. What happened next is documented in their correspondence and Sabina's diaries. The therapeutic relationship became sexually charged, emotionally intimate, and eventually crossed into what we'd now recognize as severe ethical violation. Jung later claimed the relationship never became physical, though historians debate this. What's indisputable is that it became emotionally consuming for both of them, with Jung encouraging Sabina's romantic fantasies while simultaneously trying to maintain his professional position and his marriage. This is Jung's first major confrontation with his shadow. He was capable of exploitation disguised as healing. He was capable of using his power as analyst to meet his own unconscious needs, while telling himself he was serving his patient's therapeutic growth. He was capable of profound self-deception, maintaining contradictory realities simultaneously. Loving Emma while being emotionally entangled with Sabina, claiming professional boundaries while crossing them, proclaiming psychoanalytic ethics while violating them. When the relationship finally ended catastrophically in 1909, with Sabina's mother threatening to expose Jung, with Sabina herself recognizing she'd been used, with Jung's reputation at risk, Jung's response was revealing. He wrote to Freud describing Sabina as having misunderstood his intentions, as having developed an erotic transference he hadn't encouraged, as being difficult and demanding. This is projection at its most defensive. Jung was attributing to Sabina the very desires and demands that had driven his own behavior. Only years later, during his Red Book period of radical self-examination, could Jung admit the truth. He had been possessed by his unconscious anima and had acted it out with Sabina rather than integrating it internally. Sabina had served as his projection screen for the soul material he couldn't access in himself. Creativity, erotic vitality, intellectual daring, emotional intensity. She seemed to embody everything his relationship with Emma lacked, but she didn't actually embody it. He had projected his own unlived qualities onto her, then become addicted to seeing himself reflected in her eyes. The affair wasn't about love. It was about Jung seeking his own soul in another person's body. And when he couldn't maintain the illusion anymore, when reality intruded, he abandoned Sabina and blamed her for the destruction his own unconsciousness had created. This is the pattern Jung would later identify in countless patients. But first he had to recognize it in himself. If the Sabina relationship was possession by shadow, the Tony Wolff relationship was possession by anima, and Jung's attempt to integrate it while still refusing full consciousness. Tony Wolff entered Jung's life around 1910, initially as a patient, later as his student, eventually as his long-term intimate companion. Unlike Sabina, Tony was Jung's intellectual equal. She became his analytical partner, his creative collaborator, his soror mystica, mystical sister in alchemical terms. And unlike the Sabina affair, which imploded, The relationship with Tony continued for decades, with Emma Jung's painful awareness and constrained consent. Jung attempted to rationalize this arrangement psychologically. He suggested that men need multiple forms of anima connection: the wife who provides grounding and practical reality, the anima woman who provides soul and creative inspiration. Some Jungian analysts have defended this as Jung living out an archetypal configuration, as pioneering new relational models, as demonstrating that monogamy might not serve individuation. But Jung's own Red Book entries tell a different story. In his private confrontations with the unconscious, Jung faced a devastating truth. He was still projecting. He was still avoiding the work of internal anima development by maintaining an external vessel for those energies. He writes of encountering his anima as an autonomous figure who tells him, "You think Tony is me, but she is not me. I am inside you, and you refuse to face me directly, because that would mean facing all the parts of yourself you've disowned." Jung began to recognize that his rationalization about needing multiple anima connections was inflation. His ego possessed by archetypal energy and creating elaborate justifications for what was essentially unconscious behavior. The relationship with Tony served functions beyond genuine intimacy. It allowed Jung to maintain his creative potency without doing the difficult internal work of accessing his own anima. It protected him from the full demands of intimate marriage with Emma, where his shadow and his limitations would be constantly visible. It inflated his sense of being special, exceptional, beyond conventional morality, feeding his grandiosity rather than challenging it. And it caused profound suffering to Emma, who endured decades of humiliation and emotional abandonment, to Tony, who wanted full partnership but never received it, to Jung himself, who lived in constant internal contradiction. This is perhaps the most important lesson from Jung's struggle. Even psychological brilliance doesn't exempt you from unconscious possession. Jung could analyze others' anima projections with stunning clarity, while remaining partially unconscious about his own. He could write profound theories about shadow integration, while still acting out unintegrated shadow material in his relationships. He could teach about the necessity of withdrawing projections, while maintaining elaborate external projections that structured his daily life. This isn't hypocrisy, it's the human condition. We see clearly in certain domains, while remaining radically blind in others. We integrate certain shadow elements while others continue to drive us unconsciously. The crisis point came between 1913 and 1916, triggered by Jung's break with Freud, but extending far deeper into his own psyche. Jung experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period where he deliberately descended into his own shadow material, using active imagination and artistic expression to encounter the figures and forces that had been driving his behavior. The Red Book documents this descent with brutal honesty. Jung encounters his anima as multiple figures, sometimes wise, sometimes demonic, sometimes seductive, sometimes rejecting. Through dialogue with these figures, he begins to understand that he's been seeking externally what he needs to develop internally. One passage is particularly revealing. Jung imagines his anima saying,